Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Our topic today is defining success before spend, help brands plan global audio. I'm Cameron. I'm one of the co-founders at Magellan AI. We're the leader in audio ad attribution and ad intelligence. And I'm joined today by Brent Lightfoot from iHeartMedia. So to kick us off, I'd love to hand it over to you and ask you to introduce yourself and share a bit about your background.
Sure, thanks, Cameron. Brent Lightfoot, iHeartMedia, Senior Vice President of Research, Insights, and Measurement. Been with iHeart for just over 10 years now. Spent a decade with Nielsen and all sorts of other stops along the way.
So iHeart is America's most listened to audio provider, heard by 9 out of 10 Americans each month. So as you expand internationally, how are you thinking about your role in Europe and more globally?
Yeah, a good question. We've been very fortunate in that we work with some very large multinational brands, and they like what we've been doing for them in the United States, and so they've asked us, how can we duplicate this in other regions and other countries? And so we've ventured down that journey, that path, so to speak, rather quickly, but it's been a wild and fun ride, and it's only going to continue.
That's great. So let's get started. What's one thing about audio advertising that people consistently underestimate?
Well, I think there's an underestimation of a couple of things. We would focus first on making sure that you've got your KPI aligned to what you are actually setting up and doing. For example, if sales is your goal, we need to know that up front, because that's actually going to dictate or should dictate what you should be doing in terms of media, right? And sometimes we kind of think about that backwards. We say, let's build a plan here, and then at the end, we're like, oh yeah, how are we going to measure this? So I think that's key, and I know it sounds basic, but these are things that we're dealing with all the time.
Knowing what you actually want to achieve with the campaign sounds important before really getting going. So what should really be defined? It's a great segue. What really should be defined before media planning begins?
So defining those specific outcomes that you're trying to get to, right? And I mentioned sales a moment ago. So if we're looking at conversions such as sales or form fills or click-throughs or whatever that happens to be, let's define that up front. And let's think about it and kind of go from there.
And so let's talk a little bit about some of the different tools that you've seen around things like media mix modeling. How do you work with that?
Yeah, that's a great topic. So I think MMM has kind of evolved quickly. Thank goodness it has, because early on, MMM was not doing a good job for audio. Some models were not even including audio at all, or they're bucketing, radio, podcast, streaming all into one pile. Very difficult for the marketer to actually know what was and wasn't working. Not to mention the fact that different media types are going to perform at different levels because they have different costs, they have different response rates, they have different reach, right? So I think the models are getting a lot better, and that's a great thing. But we also need to think about within that MMM model, and I know others have talked about this. We always think about this. If you have an example of an MMM model where you're looking at data from last quarter plus 2 months, so you're talking about something that happened almost half a year ago. So then what is the client supposed to do? What is the publisher supposed to do during campaign to optimize? What's working, what's not working? I don't want to tell you half a year from now what worked and what didn't work. I want to tell you what worked in the last 2 weeks so that we can make it work better for the next 2 weeks.
So how do you how do you actually handle that in the context of MMM models and other tools you might be using?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the key things is to make sure that we're aligned with our clients on, hey, we're also going to be measuring in other manners, where we're going to use someone like a Magellan AI to tell us what's happening in near real time and use that to optimize. But you do also you've got to get alignment from the client as well, right? You can't just say, hey, we're going to be measuring this and don't worry about it. Trust me, the first thing they're going to ask you on that first call for the check-in is they're going to say, well, what's working? What's not working? And you've got to have that data that it's table stakes, as I like to say, right? Didn't used to be, now it is it's expected, it's got to be there. And the other thing that we're starting to talk to clients about that are really leaning in heavily to MMM is saying, I need not only something to measure you along the way, I need to make sure that my measurement and attribution is aligning with the MMM results. Because the worst thing that can happen is you get great, and this has happened, right? It's happened a lot of places, I'm sure, but I saw it directly a couple of weeks ago. We had data that looked just incredibly good for a client. And so based on that data that we were seeing, we optimized a little bit more into podcast, and the MMM came back and said, well, podcast was the worst performing audio channel. And we're like, how can this be? That doesn't make sense. So that's when we tell clients, if you see differences between your attribution models and your MMM, that's when you need to start asking questions of how is that model built? Is it doing everything the way you expect it to be doing? Maybe it's not.
So we talked a little bit about different KPIs that brand might be targeting, sales being one of them that's big. How do you actually translate a business objective like that into a clear role for audio in the broader media plan?
I think the way to think about it is making sure that, again, we talked about sales as an example. So maybe it's cost per acquisition, CPA, CAC, one of those metrics. Trust me, somebody's going to ask about ROAS. And so when we're having that conversation with the customer up front, we're talking again, as I said, about what are we going to measure? How are we going to measure? What are we going to report on? And then there's probably some other metrics that we also want to include that the client's not thinking about, but because we're the audio experts, we say, no, we also need to look at this metric. We need to look. A good example would be, I don't know that every client is super focused on frequency. But we know that we need frequency at a certain level to actually maximize conversions, right? So it's this big stew, if you will, of data and information that we want to cook up to make sure that things are working well.
Stew of data, my favorite. Is there anything that brands forget in particular that when they're planning audio?
We like to talk about radio presenters, radio DJs are the original influencers. And those types of things are incredibly powerful to help build brands, particularly brands that are new, evolving, or moving into new spaces. And so being able, whether you're using a radio presenter or a podcast host or whoever, those are real human voices. And that's something that we see in our research all the time, that people love and desire that human connection. And so having that real human talking to you about a brand, it lends immediate trust to that brand and helps drive sales, I think, a lot faster. And we see that time and time again, that those influencers are driving higher response rates than a non-influencer type ad program.
So we've talked about being on the same page about KPIs, being on the same page about measuring results and kind of looking at results in both real time and against MMM models that the brand may already be using, and about how there are kind of some unique aspects of audio like that host listener relationship. So all that sounds great in theory. How do you actually take it global? Are there considerations that are unique to running an audio campaign, in Europe compared to the U.S.?
Right. So there's several, obviously, and I'm pretty sure that everybody in the room understands. Once we're in Europe, we've got GDPR rules and restrictions that we have to follow. So that's a consideration. It's what you do with that that helps kind of drive that thing. So an example that we might look at is to say, well, in the States, we have access to a little bit more data, a little deeper data, and we can actually get down to person level information and use that to tell us who and how to target. Well, we can't do that in all parts of the world, but what we can do is something that's specific to iHeart. I'm not saying we're the only ones that can do this, but we've created psychographic networks. So an example of a psychographic network is something that we called sneakerheads. Those sneakerheads is a group of more ethnic, young, unmarried males who are educated, and they're into sports and collecting sneakers. And so we can create these personas, if you will, that are based around the content of the podcasts that are being presented, and saying, okay, well, this podcast fits into this bucket. If that's the type of individual you're looking to market, I think that's a great way to kind of overcome some of the limitations of GDPR.
How does that compare, like the psychographic network, how does that compare with what you would have done, in the past prior to having that?
Well, I think the old school way that we were talking about, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago or less was, well, we'll just align this based on genre. Rock and roll versus pop, country, right? And the problem with that as being a researcher or just people that think about these things is a lot of these formats are pretty broad. Radio formats, radio genres are designed to attract a lot of different types of people. But when we're marketing, we want to market to more specific types of potential customers. So I think we've got to move beyond genre into psychographic networks as an example.
Makes sense. So targeting sounds like pretty big difference in terms of like how you approach the market. Anything else, different about US versus Europe?
Well, obviously, it's pretty obvious, but I will mention it and I'll tell you why in a second, and that is language, right? So when you're running in a country that has multiple languages spoken, the question the client is going to ask you is, well, what language should I run my ads in? And we saw something interesting, and I'll make a broader point here on this. We were running a campaign in Germany, and we were running English and German ads, and we actually found that the English language ads, that creative performed better in terms of conversions. We were a little surprised to see that. And my bigger comment is, if you just said, well, it's Germany, I'm going to run my ads in German, and you didn't take the time to create the extra creative and test it and learn from it, that's how you get better. That's how you get smarter. That's when you're a partner with your client. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. How do you actually work with clients, speaking of being a partner with clients, to actually set expectations for how measurement is different in markets where data availability may also be different?
Well, our clients that are in market definitely understand. And they've seen this before. They've been running marketing campaigns for a long time, and they understand the limitations. They still want to ask the questions, and they still want things answered. So we consult for two reasons. One, a lot of the brand folks really get it, but you have to remember when you're sending data and information about a large advertising campaign, there are other stakeholders at that client that don't understand things the same level as the media team does. And so everybody at the client level needs to be educated on, this is what we're doing, this is how we're measuring, this is why we're doing it this way, and these are the signals we're going to be looking for. So even though data might be more limited in GDPR, we're still looking at for some of those same signals and other factors that kind of, I say, triangulates us into saying, these things look pretty good, this thing's not quite right, this is the change we want to make, and this is why we're making that change to the campaign.
So it sounds like one of the big challenges overall is measurement. And earlier you mentioned Magellan AI and some of the work that we've been doing together. Let's talk a little bit about specifically like broadcast radio attribution. What's your history there? How would you have tackled that in the past?
Yeah, so I had to stop and think about this the other day, getting ready for this, and it's been 8 years since we've been doing broadcast radio attribution. I think iHeart was at the forefront of this, and we thought we got pretty good at it, but we definitely hit a wall, so to speak, right? Because there was only certain things you could do, right? You take your spot logs, and you take web visitation, and then you've got to use time-based attribution measurement. Well, what happened within 10 minutes of a commercial airing? Well, of course,
Didn't pull over and buy a product after you heard an ad on the radio when you were driving?
Well, exactly, and we were talking about this beforehand a little bit. The reality is that sometimes audio is that last media that is consumed right before purchase, as you're driving your car to the car park, as you are walking or commuting or whatever you're doing. And so that's why audio is important, which I think we understand. But the other thing is, when we talk about methodologies, time-based attribution, like you said, I kind of liked the fact that it was limited because I could say to a client with a straight face, we're undercounting. We're not overcounting here. We're undercounting because we're only looking at 10 minutes. But the publisher side of me and other clients and other people at my own company were saying, well, that's crazy. That's undervaluing audio if I'm only going to take credit for 10 minutes. So I know the new program that we're working with you guys on, the methodology is using, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, I'm sure, but the methodology there is able to capture 14 days, 30 days worth of activity. So now you're putting audio on the same level playing field as other types of digital measurement in terms of that attribution window and that credit. And so that's all we really want is audio to get a fair shake.
Yep. So what's changed that actually has made that possible?
So one of the big things that's changed is, and unique to iHeart, is that we've got a system that we are branding as audio guide. Mm-hmm. And what we've got is we actually have exposure level data to radio listening. Nobody else in the US really has this right now except for iHeart. And the way we're able to do it is if you are choosing to consume one of our radio stations through your smartphone, if you're in that city and you have location services turned on, you're getting a 100% simulcast of that broadcast ad onto your phone. So now for a portion of that buy, we have the actual person level information on who was exposed to that ad. And then if they did go visit the website, we can track that. So now we've got some data, which is better than zero data, to be able to help inform the model that you guys are using. I'm really excited about it because I tell you, it's a lot easier to explain to somebody that, we actually have listening data that we're using to inform this versus saying, well, we're just looking at the spot logs.
Yeah, and so that kind of better measurement really leads to hopefully the more level playing field, fair investment in audio. So once you have that better measurement in place, where does audio fit alongside video, social, other digital channels when brands are evaluating campaign performance?
This is a conversation I feel like I'm having every single day. It's like Groundhog Day. Because you have to think about the media that's being used in the plan. And depending on what your measurement is, if the client is interested in ROI and ROAS, there's a big difference between a social media campaign that you might be paying $2, $3, $4, $5 $1,000 for, and podcasts, depending on what you're doing with podcasts, you might be spending $30, $35 $1,000. So you're going to get different responses and different conversion rates across all different media types. But again, with the things that we're doing now with you guys with broadcast radio, that puts all of it on a level playing field in terms of we're using the same types of metrics to do the measurement. And so while there may be some differences between radio and streaming and podcasting, we can look at that at one time using the same types of measurements and metrics, and then help make really good decisions.
How does adding audio like impact a plan if, when you're thinking about like an advertiser going to market with, video and digital, and let's say if they were to leave off audio, how does adding audio like change the math for them?
Yeah, and I'm gonna glance at my notes here because I don't want to misquote the wrong thing, because that's like the worst thing a research guy could do, right? So we've done some research and we've been focused in on this a lot, because this is a conversation we have with clients all the time, that are not using audio, and why do they need to be using audio? So when we're adding audio to existing media plans, we're finding an 83% increase in social activity, 109% increase in digital engagement, and a 47% in search activity.
Pretty powerful. So how do you connect performance back to business outcomes in a way that leadership trusts? We've talked about a lot of the raw metrics. I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so again, and I feel like I keep going back to the start of the conversation, which I think is an okay thing, but to say, look, if you're having an honest conversation with the client up front about how we're going to be measured, that's going to determine a lot of those things. But the second thing is as you're going along and presenting and reporting, you're constantly asking questions of the client, right? I'm not just presenting the number and my insights, as good as they may be. I want to make sure that they're aligned with what the client is seeing. So if we're capturing sales data from their website, I'm now asking the client, hey, this is what we saw for sales for you last week. Does that align with what you're seeing internally? Well, yes, it is. And if the answer is no, it's not, then we want to dig further to find out, well, why is that the case? Did we not set that part of the pixel up correctly on that web page? Are we not getting all the data? All these type of things. Again, there's a lot of checks and rechecks, but I think that's the key to success here.
So coming in for a landing here, where do you see the biggest opportunity for brands that are just starting to think about audio globally?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a stat that I think will bring this home for everybody. So in the US, when we look at daily media consumption, 31% of a person's day is using audio. But when we look at media plans, usually clients are only allocating about 3% of their total ad spend to audio. So I think that that's a huge opportunity for clients that aren't utilizing audio right now to get into that space and really punch above their weight in terms of being able to build their brand using audio.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Hopefully this gives everyone a clearer picture of how to think about audio, not just as a channel, but as a measurable performance driving part of the mix like other channels. Thank you, Brent, for joining me here. And thank you all for joining us.